We already discussed hints from the Old Testament about the temple location, and that it is not very likely that someone would build a threshing floor far from his suppliers and clients. The extra length of logistical lines doesn't add any value, and the alternative location for the temple and for the threshing floor is therefore more likely. In this video I want to discuss the hints derived from the New Testament. It is not that the New Testament gives a direct hint for the location of the temple, but there might be an indication about the state the temple was in after the War of 70 AD. There's also information in the New Testament that corroborate what we already knew from Josephus. That is the elevated position of the Roman fortress relative to the temple, as well as the significant Roman presence in Jerusalem. You can find that in the Acts of the Apostle, the chapters 21 till 23. You can read that for yourself, but basically it confirms Josephus. The fortress Antonia is high above the temple, and Antonia contained a significant Roman military presence. The thing I want to discuss here is the prophecy of Jesus about the destruction of the temple and the consequence that has for its location. Now, that story is being told in Matthew 24, also in other places, but let's look at Matthew 24. And now there are two ways to look at this prophecy. There are two different ways to value these prophecies. It might be a genuine prophecy made by Jesus just a couple of days prior to his death, recorded by his disciples in the few decades that followed these events. Or these prophecies are made up post factum, so after the fact, by unknown authors in the 80s or the 90s of the first century. Now, my contention is that either way, both valuations of this prophecy leads to the conclusion that it is far more likely that this citadel here isn't the Temple Mount, but Fortress Antonia. First, the assumption that it was a genuine prophecy. In that case, we are dealing here with a Jesus who knew what would happen with the temple in advance and was about to bring the ultimate sacrifice, namely that of his own life. Or to say it in the words of Jesaja 53, to be brought as a lamb to the slaughter, to bore our griefs, to carry our sorrows, to be cut off out of the land of the living for our transgressions and iniquities that God has laid upon him. Now, the way that this is interpreted is that this ultimate sacrifice would make the Jewish sacrificial system obsolete. Not temporarily postponed, adjourned, so to speak, but finished, definitively. And with this theological background, the utter destruction of the temple is far more fitting. It's not like the first temple and its destruction by the Babylonians that left a foundation still more or less intact with a promise of renewal. It was meant to be different here. I won't say that it is impossible to interpret the words of Jesus in another way. The wordings, let's go back to Matthew 24. The wording is that the no stones would be left upon each others of all these buildings, plural. Now, it isn't specified in this discussion about the buildings of the temple and its destruction whether or not the foundations were included. So in that sense, there was, as always with prophecies, some vagueness and some wiggle room for interpretations. But given the real meaning of the sacrifice Jesus was about to bring at the time he was uttering these words, it is most likely he meant the destruction of the temple, including its foundation. And therefore, that this building here, with still a lot of stones upon each other, not being the temple. Now, the funny thing is that when you take the prophecy, if you don't take this prophecy as being genuine, that is, this prophecy is basically a made-up story after the facts took place, so written after the year 70 AD, in that case, it's even more likely that this here on the screen, as we see, is not the Temple Mount, because let's face it, if you want to convince your readers of the prophetic qualities of the hero in your story, make sure you put the right prophetic words in his mouth. Don't let him say, no stone will be left upon another of all these buildings, plural, while in reality 85% of the stones were still strongly connected together. That's not the way to make converts, so to speak. Not a way to convince anyone. You are setting the story up in order to be forgotten quickly. So, also in this scenario, with people putting words in Jesus' mouth after the facts, the words most likely did describe the facts, that no stone was left upon another. And therefore it is more likely that this structure here in front of you isn't the Temple Mount. In fact, it reminds me of a story I once heard about a Polish recruitment officer scanning the population to find people with sniper qualities, who once passed a barn covered with bullseyes, with bullet shots right in the middle. Now, in that case, it turned out to be from someone who shot first and then draw a bullseyes around it. But putting words into the mouth of a prophet-to-be after the facts had taken place, but not describing the facts correctly, this would be like shooting first and then draw a bullseye next to the hole. Now, anyway, the prophecy of Jesus, being genuine or not, points more in the direction of the alternative location without any stone upon another than to this vast citadel-like structure. Now, in the rest of the New Testament, the temple is mentioned quite often with all kinds of features and properties, like having cloisters and a Solomon's porch and several gates, and being visible from the Mount of Olives and beneath Fortress Antonia. But these pieces of information don't distinguish between the conventional and the alternative position. So this is the alternative position, and this one the conventional position. In my next video I will discuss the possible reasons why people did start thinking that the Temple Mount was the place where the temple once stood, and hopefully that will be tomorrow. Thank you for listening.